But in Diamond, it starts to become a lot. Cross record. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start by sharing my screen. Okay. I should mention though, I am currently on a work laptop type thing. I am away from home, so if you do see a random stutter, that's just what it is. Okay, so don't pay too much mind to it. So here's what's gonna happen. So today, movement and holding angles. What is the difference between the two? Why do you need to know both? Why are they both intertwined here? Okay. First, let's start with just understanding how each individual rank tends to hold angles and how each individual rank tends to misplace themselves crosshair wise, positioning wise, and how they tend to take fights. Okay. We're going to first grab this example by using these little rods over here that they're moving. And then I'm going to place down this.
Match found. Deathmatch. Warm up.
Stay in range of my stim beacon, and we'll mow them down.
Fight!
Safety's off.
this wall.
Barrier created.
What you're gonna notice is that depending on where you are, elo-wise, you're gonna hold this angle a little differently. Okay? Why are they both intertwined here? Okay. First, let's start with just understanding how each individual rank tends to hold angles and how each individual rank tends to misplace themselves crosshair-wise, positioning-wise, and how they tend to take fights. Okay. We're gonna first grab this example by using these little rods over here that they're moving, and then I'm gonna place down this wall.
Barrier created.
What you're gonna notice is that depending on where you are, elo-wise, you're gonna hold this angle a little differently. Okay, the movement that you're gonna take in which you approach this angle will vary depending on where you are. Okay, I've seen a lot of different ranks that do wildly different things. Okay, and the biggest thing that really helps the approach on how you hold and how you swing has a matter of confidence that we kind of need to address in the lower elos, but they never feel confident taking that angle in the first place because they don't feel like they have the aim to back it up. Okay, so let's start with like the lower elos.
Wall raised.
This is all the way from gold all the way to iron. Okay, the only difference between them is simply the higher up you go, the better aim they have, or a little bit more game sense. But at the end of the day, they still lack some of the big requirements, like consistent crosshair placement is a good example. Okay, another one that you might miss is how potentially they're gonna hold the angle. Sometimes they hold it at such awkward angles that by the time that this guy swings, notice how they're not ready to really catch him, right? Notice how like this guy's just constantly over swinging and they need to directly land on them in order for them to get lucky, right? Notice how they keep swinging out and like the majority of the times they're not even landing on my crosshair, right? This is a good example of how movement, crosshair placement, and holding an angle all kind of tie back in together.
Barrier created.
Let's take it into higher elos. What do they do? Well, you're still going to see a little bit of that in diamond. However, they're starting to see how movement tends to affect the way that they take fights. Okay, some might borrow from the pros and they might realize that they're better off just jiggling back and forth between the angle. Some of them might like to pick an off angle, where the second that they land in, as you can see, they're going to start landing a little bit more consistently on my crosshair, assuming they even swing. Okay, let's say there's something like this. There's an off angle, right? A little bit of a movement is all it takes. Whereas it's something like this, I'm right too close to the wall. All they're going to do is wall bang me. Okay. It is important to discuss when you're holding angles, to understand perspectives, distances,
Wall raised.
and understanding how the way that you're holding your angle will impact your fight. Okay, so let's tackle the first one. Okay, the perspective that you're holding has to do with your character model and the character model that you're fighting. As you can see from this little glimpse right there, sometimes you might catch a little bit of the enemy's body. Okay, when you catch a little bit of that enemy's body, that means that you have the chance to shoot them before they can even see you. But what happens if they have the opposite view? How can they gain this? This has to do with how far you are from the angle or the wall that you're playing with. So let's say I want to place down this wall right here. The farther I am from the wall, the much of a bigger chance I have in catching this opponent and being able to see them before they see me. Okay? When you're bringing movement into this, you can actually use movement to properly gauge, you know, the distance that you're playing with, okay? And probably even position yourself in a place where you have an easier chance of fighting, okay? It is good to note that when you're using movement, a lot of players think that just because they have bigger distances, they can just start doing something like this, okay? If I had a little guide, what I'm basically doing, I'm pressing W and D at the same time, okay? Can someone tell me why W and D is not a good way to approach an angle? Or WA. I'm basically moving diagonally.
On their screen, you're moving way slower.
Okay, good. So if I'm moving from farther away and I'm approaching an angle, you're right. I am moving way slower. What's another one?
Barrier created.
Let's say the fight started to happen. What's going to occur?
कोच क्रो एक डिफरेंट गेम है हेड कोच आणि मग त्याच्या with the slug, for example.
Okay, what's that? Okay. So I don't think he's trying to respond. Okay. So a good answer for this would be simply when you're trying to move, this is the big mistake you start seeing up in Diamond. Again, this is something that you've seen like quite before, but in Diamond, it starts becoming a lot more prominent. Okay. When you're moving and you're using both of these keys, when you try to stop, okay, you're going to see that little thing right there. Okay. That's movement there, and it usually happens because players don't tend to be using dead zoning to their advantage or counter strafing or anything of that matter. And they're basically using two movement keys to approach an angle. As you can see, that was around that area over there and it landed in the bottom. That's basically what happens when you're using two keys at the same time. You can fix this by gating the distance you want
Barrier created.
and essentially taking the fight from farther away. Okay? Taking the fight you want and only moving A and D. If you watch anybody that, you know, looks like they know what they're doing, every single time they're taking a fight, they're moving like this. They're not moving like this. Right? They're not putting A and D. They're not putting W and D. Or they're not moving diagonally across into an angle like this. Rather, you notice that they're taking an angle, they're making sure that they're farther away from the angle, and then they just approach it using one of the directional keys, either A or D. Okay? This is how a movement tends to impact a lot of players. Okay? And this is how you see how most of the time when they approach an angle and they're trying to catch someone off guard, okay? When they do something like this, they're not gonna be ready. Okay? Let's say I wanted to hit that guy, well, it wasn't even close. Right? So that's one of the biggest problems when it comes to perspective. Okay? Because they're trying to incorporate this movement and they're trying to move back and forth sometimes, and they're not really applying the concepts of how A and B are different than that of S and W. Okay? So point number one is simply put, perspective wise, make sure you're farther from the wall if you're trying to slowly approach an opponent. But make sure that you're not doing it diagonally. Okay? If you're ready to take a fight, stop pressing W. Take a moment and hold that angle. This is great because I've noticed that for players that actually incorporate this, they gain two things. The first one is timing, and the second one is they get to hold an angle with a slightly bigger advantage. Because as you can tell,
Barrier created.
you might have seen some of the pro players that tend to do something like this, where they're basically jiggling around the corner. What they're doing is simply, they're making sure that they're checking around the corner, right? Making sure that there's no one there, but all they're doing is moving A and D. Okay? Does that make sense? Does the idea of A and D make sense? Does the idea of the perspective in which you're holding make sense? And does it even add to the point of simply just holding not too close? Any questions from that? No question.
Wait, so if you hold, what's it called? Yeah, like Sage hold, please.
Wall
And
raised.
then if you're doing the 80 peak, and if you're trying to peek close to the wall, are you at a disadvantage or like an advantage?
If you're too close to the wall,
Yes.
notice this guy right here. Notice how I can see
Yeah.
him. He can't see me. He's at a
Yeah.
disadvantage.
Okay.
Okay. This is why I had to bring in the idea of perspectives. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Makes sense.
That's right. Ideally,
Can I
you want to
also
make sure that
mention
you're
something
taking
on
those
top of that?
angles. Sorry, what's up?
Can I mention something on top of that?
Yeah, sure.
When you're peeking from closer, if you swing out, you're exposing yourself to a lot more angles than if you like slow peek from further away. That's one thing.
That is actually a really good point to make. So let's say, for example, you're over here. You want to clear this angle right there. I find that a lot of players tend to do this, right? Notice how much they're exposing themselves to.
Oh yeah.
Jiggling
yeah.
allows you to be able to clear those angles a lot more effectively. Okay,
Thank you.
no worries. Okay, so basically we've tackled basically the difference between, let's say, diamonds to all the way down to the golds and irons and whatnot. Okay, so what about a little bit higher up? What is the difference between an ascendant and a diamond? Well, a lot of players are going to start finding that aim is becoming more dominant. Okay, how does that movement in between the way that you hold an angle and the way that you peek, how does that influence the way that you take the fight? So one thing that you're going to notice about the way that ascendants tend to play, okay, they love to ego. Okay, and I'm not just talking about ego swinging, long swings, popping swings. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about just taking the angle. I'm talking about how most of the time they'll take an angle that is so unfavorable to them, right, that their only objective is to be able to flick between 1 and then 2, right? They don't put themselves in a position
Wall raised.
where they can play around the 2 different angles. Okay, they don't even tend to move. They just do like tiny little jitter steps. They don't put themselves in different positions when they're taking multiple fights. In fact, I would even say that a lot of you think that you guys can win like this fight right here, right? All you need to do is just kind of do this little bit of a swing, a little bit of a jiggle, and you're good, right? That's not how it works, unfortunately. Most of the time, positioning is king when it comes to taking fights, and in the off chance that you do catch yourself in a 2v1, I suggest that you guys pay attention to what the higher elos are doing, okay? You should never do this. Never go for like a flick randomly, okay? I find that a lot of players do this and then they start crouching immediately, or they'll do this and then they start doing this, right? Don't just do that. It places you in one spot, okay? So movement wise, it's not gonna really give you much. So let's say, for example, I was holding this angle, okay? How would I take multiple fights? Well, ideally what you're gonna do is you're gonna try to isolate fights. Notice how as I am isolating fights, notice how I'm taking different angles. Notice how I'm pushing myself farther away from the wall, okay? Notice how my crosshair placement is indicative of where I'm trying to fight. I am pre-aiming my area to make sure that I can hit the guy that I'm trying to kill, right? I'm not just simply going for fights like this where I'm trying to get those flicks all the time. Okay, this happens a lot. This is actually where I catch most ascendants struggling. In fact, I've seen so many rounds lost because they put themselves in open areas, or they don't think about their position, or they don't think about the long-term consequences of the fights that they're about to take in the long term. Planning is essential when you're about to take that fight. Okay, so if you're looking at an angle, you gotta think about how many fights am I gonna take here. A good example is Lotus. Okay, you guys know the tree area, right? The tree area, door opens and closes. Okay, start thinking ahead. Is there anything that can challenge me here? How are they going to challenge me? So for example, if they have an omen, they can easily flash you, so they can approach you at a faster pace, and now you have to take multiple fights. Okay, so when you're holding an angle, now it's not just simply just isolating fights. It is about thinking. It's thinking about utility. It's thinking about how I'm going to space myself between everybody else, because if they all start swinging me at once, then I'm put in that position where I'm asked to basically do this flick. Okay, sure, you can hit it sometimes, you cannot hit it sometimes. In order for you to climb, you need to be consistent, and that's the goal of this. Okay, so what can you do? What are the higher players doing? What are they trying to do? Well, put it simply, most Radiants, when I watch them play, they already have that flick down. They know they can hit that flick. They've not questioned whether they can hit that flick or not. Okay, most of the time they're pretty controlled. It is pretty different, however, how they approach the flick. When you see people flicking, they just think it's between 1 and then 2. That's it. They think that's the flick and they think that's everything. Okay. When you take 2 fights, both of the targets are going to be aiming at this exact spot that you're playing. Okay. Regardless of the distance. What I've seen players do is, when they peek,
Barrier clear.
they basically take fight number 1. And if they find the second guy and they're on cover, what are they going to do? They're going to take another fight like this, or they're going to go back into cover, right? It's pretty obvious. They're going to go back into cover and then isolate the second fight. What I find that they do when they're caught in the open, in those scenarios that I talked about, and it's just not just a matter of, right? It's not just a spray transfer. Sure, there are situations where those will happen, okay? It is not rare. It does happen. Not every player tries to be pro. But what I do notice is that those that are consistent have a little bit of movement tech. What they do is, they know they can hit this flick. But what they do instead is they like to formulate around basically juking this guy. The fight is already prepared for this guy. How can they deal with this guy? Okay. Sometimes the angle matters, but most of the time it's something as simple as just fighting on their offside. Okay, so what does that mean? Most of the time players tend to be either one side or the other. It's really hard to tell which side is best, but you can just take a little bit of a 50-50. What does that mean? Sometimes you can see that when I'm trying to flick between right and left, I might be consistent, but left and right, I might not. Okay, this is what basically they're gonna do. They're gonna take the first fight, and then they're gonna move, and then take the second fight. Okay, it is not a novel concept. Okay, you're gonna find that a lot of players think that they can just hit this flick, and they tend to just do this. They tend to just do like tiny little movements. Okay, most players think that you have to be doing these big flicks. You don't. All you have to do is hit one, and then prepare yourself for the other. What I found that most of the time they do is they choose like a big step. I don't know if you've noticed from my character model. Okay, there's a little bit of a sway. The character model essentially shows one step. When it goes all the way down and all the way up, that's a step. They choose to do one step, and then they take the second fight. I've found in most instances, when they're taking a double fight, one of them is either going to crouch or one of them is going to stay in one spot. And that's it. That is the only difference. That is the only difference I've seen from higher level aiming, higher level fights. Okay, they simply don't try to rush to the second fight. They take their time, because here's the deal, and this is what you guys need to understand. If you get caught in a 2v1, you might already have lost. Okay, but the only thing that's stopping you from winning that fight is how patient you are in taking that fight. Okay, if you are doing this and you're not, no, even there, I didn't even hit it. Okay, if you're taking that fight and you're rushing yourself through it, okay, then what's gonna happen? You're gonna lose. I'd rather you guys take your time, put yourself in a situation where you're good at just preparing yourself to take those fights. Okay, if the targets are like right next to each other, sure, I guess you might as well flick, but most of the time they're not gonna just line up for you. Okay, especially if they know how to position. Okay, so what I prefer that you guys do is that you guys figure out the targets that you guys are gonna fight and try to learn this movement. Okay, this movement is by no means hard, but implementing it in a game is much more difficult than you think. Okay, this is why I still see things like I was holding this angle. Okay, how would I take multiple fights? Well, ideally what you're gonna do is you're gonna try to isolate fights. Notice how as I am isolating fights, notice how I am taking different angles. Notice how I'm pushing myself farther away from the wall. Okay, notice how my crosshair placement is indicative of where I'm trying to fight. I am pre-aiming my area to make sure that I can hit the guy that I'm trying to kill, right? I'm not just simply going for fights like this where I'm trying to get those flicks all the time. Okay, this happens a lot. This is actually where I catch most Ascendants struggling. In fact, I've seen so many rounds lost because they put themselves in open areas, or they don't think about their position, or they don't think about the long-term consequences of the fights that they're about to take in the long term. Planning is essential when you're about to take that fight. Okay, so if you're looking at an angle, you got to think about how many fights am I going to take here. A good example is Lotus. Okay, you guys know the tree area, right? The tree area, door opens and closes. Okay, start thinking ahead. Is there anything that can challenge me here? How are they going to challenge me? So for example, if they have an Omen, they can easily flash you, so they can approach you at a faster pace. Right? They don't put themselves in a position where they can play around the two different angles. Okay? They don't even tend to move. They just do like.
If we communicate, we win. Fight. Watch and learn. Jackass.
always shows one step.
Mating.
ultimate's ready.
But in Diamond, it starts becoming a lot more prominent. All right, like I said, we're gonna be talking about movement and slicing the pie as people join in. Everybody is just pretty much just gonna be getting the same thing, okay? So again, very much a discussion of the fundamentals. I'm gonna be talking about movement down to like its tiny, nitty-gritty type of thing, and then we're gonna be moving into more advanced concepts like picking fights and sort. Okay, so the first few things that I want to talk about is just understanding movement as a whole. Okay, so what better way to start understanding it than by looking at some clips? I need you guys to kind of look at what exactly it is that they're doing that you might not be. Okay, doesn't take that much to find these clips. Literally just look up, you know, Valorant clips and all of these will show up. Okay, and the idea is simple. When you're looking at the way that these guys are moving, all right, I forgot that you like to do this when I'm recording. It's always like this, man. Yeah, I knew my PC was not going to handle this. Okay, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you. And it actually overloaded itself. Okay. Do you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. One of the things that you're going to notice about these clips and movement is understanding how they use their A and B keys. Okay, as these guys move around, I want to be discussing those speeds in just a little bit. But when you look at those clips, you're going to understand that they have one thing, and that's flow. If you're ever finding yourself struggling and taking any fights, it is because there's a disruption in the flow in which you're moving from one place to the next. I'm going to be showing you guys some diagrams that you guys can use to sort of relate in your own games. But a good way to kind of understand how people move that you might not be is understanding that they're peaking with A and D. Okay? When you're peaking with A and D, it is far stronger than moving with W and D or W and A. Okay? This is just as fundamental as it comes. But the problem with a lot of players is that they don't seem to understand the distance that they're using to find an opponent or really find that sort of fight that might give them an advantage. If anything, sometimes they think that they're holding an angle, that they're holding it wrong, and then someone swings them and they feel like they're getting attacked. And they don't find any sort of reasoning as to why they're losing the fights. Okay, so with that out of the way, we're going to talk about the first few things, and that's understanding that whole feeling of flow. Okay, understanding why movement is as it is, understanding why movement hits the way it does, and the reason that movement is very important in Valorant. Okay, so first, let's talk about these diagrams. Okay, so in order for you to understand movement, you need to understand perspectives. Okay, we're gonna do a little bit of a recap on previous classes, but in case you missed it, distance is pretty much, you know, it goes toe to toe with movement in Valorant because of how you can use it to get an advantage on an opponent. Okay, so let's say you are player A, okay, and player B is playing way closer to the wall. If you notice from this example, if the player is swinging the opponent, or at least they're swinging B, they're gonna have a greater chance of catching part of the opponent before they can catch them. Okay, this can go in many ways. Let's say someone is holding a really off angle off on you, okay, or maybe they're holding one of these like really weird 90s. Okay, when you are playing towards an opponent like this, most of the times I see players thinking that all they need to do is swing them, and that's all it takes. Okay, it is more than just swinging. It is more than just pressing A and D when you're planning for distances. What you need to make sure that you look into is how far you are from the wall that you're playing with. Okay, so a good example, okay, is if you're looking at an opponent and you guys are both equal distances away, one way that you can get an edge is simply by either A, moving farther away, so as you're moving away from the angle, you can catch a little bit of the opponent as you're farther away. Okay, of course, there are some problems with this idea all the time. Let's say that you're trying to find an opponent and you're trying to hug the wall as you're swinging the opponent just right here, right? Then you're gonna start hitting the wall, right? So we have problem number one. Make sure that you're paying attention to your surroundings, okay? When you're paying attention to your surroundings, it may come across as you trying to get this angle advantage on the enemy, but in reality, you're slowing down because you're hitting them, okay? Perspective comes in a lot of different ways in which that You can look at how you're holding an angle, or maybe you can look at something more in depth in abusing players that might be holding these really tight corners, but in reality, you're just able to abuse the perspective of being able to look at them before they can see you. Okay? Does anyone have any questions on this concept? The concept of being able to use distances away from the wall, being able to use perspectives to catch someone off guard, or rather see them before they can see you. Any questions on that? Okay, perfect. Okay, so just to really recap, we discussed that distances come into play when you're looking at perspectives. Okay, and the farther you are away from the wall, the slower you can take your time to sort of catch the enemy, and then you can take your time also. Now let's incorporate this into movement. Okay, movement has a lot of different ways of kind of working its way into a fight, but let's understand it just from the very, very nitty-gritty. If you're looking at opponents straight in front of you, okay, if you're just looking them straight ahead, their movement is going to be at its fastest, okay? So if two opponents are looking at each other diagonally, maybe some yellow line that every single fight that we take is by looking at how we can find ourselves looking straight ahead to the opponent. Okay, so let's say we're finding our fight right here at this corner, right? If we were playing anywhere else and we were moving at different distances, we might look like that red line right here. And in fact, I'll just make a red line just so you guys can kind of picture it better. Okay, if I were moving like the red line, I'd be using something like W and A, for example, in this scenario. And I'd be moving diagonally, and I would look much slower to the opponent that's playing right here. Okay, if we're using that same logic, we would want to be able to find a position that comfortably finds us in this little position right here. Maybe it's a T, maybe it's an I, whatever it is that, you know, fits your fancy, but you want to make sure that you're finding this optimal spot in a lot of your angles. Okay, the problem is, how do you find that optimal angle? Where exactly do you look for it? And this is where slicing the pie comes into all of this. Okay, it is how we can optimize our speed. It is how we can optimize the gunfights that we take. It is how we can account for those distances and those perspectives. Okay, so let's say, for example, you are this green dot right here. You are green. You do not know where the enemy is. We do, of course, because of this little X that we have right there, right? But in order for us to figure out exactly where X is, we can't just move in and just try to find them. You're going to see how this movement can take a lot of different lines. And this movement right here is where a lot of players fail to take their fights accordingly. It is where you find that separation between someone that's in Ascendant to someone that is in Radiant, okay? It is the way that they position themselves. I will give you guys a little bit of a little, you know, checklist that you guys can use for later, but for now, let's just kind of cover across like the basics of slicing the pie. Slicing the pie is pretty much, as you can see over here in the diagram, it is cutting up each angle, each point of view, each sight line into slices. You want to make sure that you're breaking it apart as evenly as possible so it's easier for you to take the fight. So let's say, for example, you're looking into this angle right here and you do not know what's happening in this question mark right there. A good way for you to slice the pie is for you to, instead of going in and swinging this entire square, you break it up. And you break it up into tiny pieces. It is basically just taking a huge angle and basically making it into easily more attainable spots. So let's say I decide to swing short right here. I can now deal with this area right there. Okay, I swing a little bit more. I can now deal with this area right there. I swing a little bit more. I can now deal with this area right there. Notice how I'm slowly slicing the pie, and that is giving me the advantage of being able to take on the opponent by basically trying to cut.
Yes,
Okay.
I don't really.
Okay, let's see. I do know that I could probably switch over. Oh my goodness. Head, you know, perspective wise, they're looking pretty fast. I'm pretty sure that unless you have really good control of your mouse and you feel really confident with your sensitivity, you can easily track these guys. Maybe they seem really hard to hit. Okay, whatever it is. Notice how as I slowly move away and I start again showing that diagonal speed, they start moving a lot slower. Notice how perspective wise, they're actually moving much slower in my screen. And this is much easier for me to hit than it is straight ahead. if I were to be taking abuse of that I technique or the T technique or whatever you guys want to call it, but what you guys want to use is essentially being able to look at them straight ahead. A good way for the enemy to try to avoid this situation is by putting themselves in scenarios like off angles, but more on where as possible on their screen. Okay. Mistakes like that would be, mistakes that you could make, and these are very common mistakes that you might make while you're playing the game, okay, is instead of moving left or right, like I showed you, again, this see me. And that is the same example that I was just showing with the lines kind of showing a little bit of the side of the circle, okay? So that is perspectives. Last but not least, let's talk a little bit about slicing the pie. One way that you guys can practice slicing the pie, actually, there's a lot of ways that you guys can practice slicing the pie. The best ways that I've found that players tend to practice slicing the pie is by using Sage. What they tend to do is they just put a wall in the middle, and basically what they try to do is, again, they just try to slice the pie by moving in and out, okay? By moving in and out, you're basically practicing the motion of covering the pie. I'm gonna show you guys a little bit more on crosshair placement in just a second. But if you guys want to practice just now, you can jump into the range. You can put a sage wall right in the middle, and you can practice by moving in and out. And this will give you a good idea of how you can start breaking these angles into tiny little pieces. If you feel like that's too easy, and you want to take it into a more routine-based example, you can just put 100 bots, have them move, and what you can do is, you can start from one of these angles, and what you can do is, because you don't know where the enemy is, you can start trying to move in and out. And as you look for the enemy, you can try to land on the opponent. Okay? This is a good example of, a good practice that you can take. You can use to warm up if you don't feel very confident in your movement, right? Let's say I found them, and then I can just kind of go in. And then if you're warmed up, you can take the shot, of course. But that's one example of how you can use it. I found that other players like to get different angles, so they like to use something like this, where they're basically moving in back and forth with something like this, where they can try their left and their right. And I found that other players like to use that angle over there, where they're just practicing using this area right here, because it gives them a little guide. One thing you're gonna notice is that you can actually see the opponent through here, so it gives you a little bit of a guide if you want to practice putting it into perspective. Yep. So that is the first thing. That is the basic concept of speed, okay, angles, and slicing the pie. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about slightly tougher examples. Okay, let me see if I can switch over, change windows. Perfect. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the pathing aspect of finding an angle, because what I'm finding that players tend to know is they know that idea of counter strafing, and they know that they need to swing an opponent, right? But then the problem then becomes, how do I take a fight? How do I prepare for that fight? How do I expect that fight coming in? Okay. In order for you to be able to master movement, you need to understand that you can't do everything at once. You need to make sure that you're preparing it ahead of time, okay? And a lot of movement is preparation based. A lot of movement is about making an expectation of what fight you want to take, and then from there you kind of take it, okay? This is why you see in a lot of those like high level clips, you see that some of the times it doesn't even feel like they even knew they were there. They're just taking that precaution that they might be, or maybe they're pre-aiming, or maybe they are pre-firing, okay? And these are things that really do help in taking those fights, okay? So let's say, using this example, that you want to go from A to B, okay? In order for you to move in, you might just kind of start taking this angle, and you're trying to find this line. Oh, that's what's happening. You're trying to basically cross to this position, as quickly as possible. Some players like to just kind of make a more geometric shape when they're getting there. I find that some players maybe like to hug the outside of the wall as they come in. Some players like to take the fastest route, which is something like this. Okay, depending on what you're doing, okay, it is important to note that you can't just kind of go to point A to point B when you know the enemies are nearby. Okay, so let's say there's an enemy right here, or maybe there's an enemy right here. How do you prepare for something like this? Okay, by using slicing the pie, you can prepare for opponents, Okay, and you should be preparing for the closest opponent each time. So let's say you are the green dot right here. What you would do is you would prepare yourself to swing this guy first, and then you would go back in. And then what you would do is then you would prepare for this guy. So you swing out, and then you swing for this guy, and then you go back in. Okay. So remember, you have to make sure that you establish the position that you want to fight, and then from there you can prepare. Okay. A good way for you to prepare is something that's commonly taught in a lot of tactical games, most importantly that of CSGO. Okay. CSGO actually has a thing where they teach you how to properly take fights. Okay. And I'm about to teach you that right now. So one thing that I was showing when I was taking these fights is you might have noticed that I wasn't cutting directly into the line, and I wasn't moving like this. I wasn't tracking around the corner. That was actually not my intention. Okay. What a lot of players tend to do is they actually like to prepare their crosshair into the wall when they're taking the fight. Okay. A good thing that you guys can practice when you're using this little technique that I just showed right here is practicing essentially getting the crosshair directly into the wall. So when you swing, you land where you want to fight. Okay. You guys can practice this in a million different ways. Okay. You guys can practice with something like using the wall here. Okay. And just having everybody up. And then what you can do is just kind of swing in and see if you land. Of course, I would rather you guys not have strafing bots because you need to practice landing on your opponent. But then once you get a little bit better, you can start kind of finding the opponent as you move back as you move back and forth. Okay. It is important for you guys to be able to kind of detail the idea of the enemy is going to be around this area. So I'm going to prepare ahead of time and swing him by jiggling him. Okay, so a good example is right here, right? Notice how I'm landing right on the opponent. You guys can practice by shooting. Maybe you guys want to practice by just landing your crosshair on them, whichever way possible. Does this work? Yeah, it's going to be 1080 until I get my new PC coming in. Then that's for now. So to use. Okay, some of the last few concepts here that I need to cover are going to be much easier. Okay, so as you can see, we've established the fight that we want to take. Okay, we've prepared what fight we want to obviously kind of like apply in. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're moving directly in that eye like we've shown. And we want to make sure that we're preparing the crosshair into the wall when we're swinging out. Okay, but not everything goes according to plan. Okay, there's a couple things that you guys can use to sort of practice this idea. Okay, so let's say you're swinging and somebody peeks you during the time that you're kind of swinging, so your crosshair's not it's not directly into like the crosshairs. The crosshair is not in the person's head. Okay, so let's say that's one of the problems that you're kind of going in. Or maybe you've been slicing the pie and then someone out of nowhere swings. Or maybe you're slicing the pie and you overswung. Okay, how do you prepare for these fights? Okay, there's a couple of things that players tend to make mistakes on when it comes to movement. They think that faster is better. They think that they need to have better mechanics. Sometimes they think that it's better for them to be able to micro adjust the most. Okay, there's a couple of things that we need to kind of discuss. The first one is to not insta crouch. If your crosshair does not land directly on their head and you were planning ahead of time to be able to kind of deal with this opponent, but they moved up and they surprised you, okay, the last thing you want to do is sit down and basically let the opponent instantly tap you. Okay, I find that some players find it easier to just unbind crouch if that is something that they struggle with. I recommend that your best bet is to just jump into a death match, okay, and just get tapped. I'm being serious. Sometimes just jumping into like a death match and just getting shot a bunch of times teaches you how much time you actually have to move, to actually correct your crosshair into their head, to prepare for a fight. all of those things really come in handy. I've actually found that in higher elos, sometimes they'll get jumped, and instead of just trying to flick into the opponent, which they can do, I'm sure they have the mechanics to do that. Okay, what they do is they actually go back into cover, and sometimes they even run and gun as they're running back into cover. They're not trying to get the shot. They're not trying to get the fight when they are not ready for it. Okay, and this is why you see those clips of people just running and gunning sometimes, because they're just not trying to take that fight. They just got lucky. Okay, don't insta crouch. The more you can move, the easier it is. The easier it's going to be for you at the very least to take those fights. Okay. The second one is dancing. Okay. Dancing is something that we apply, you know, in Valorant. It's something that we've talked about here in Training Grounds. And the concept is simple. When you're looking at an opponent, okay, sometimes what you guys are both going to do is going to start moving back and forth. Okay. And this is kind of the concept of dancing. You're moving left, you're moving right, they're moving to the right, you're moving left. Okay, you're both are going to be moving back and forth. Okay, and the idea simply is the more you move, the harder it is for them to hit you. Okay, and that is true. Okay, you want to make sure that you're not standing still. But I've found that some players tend to move way too much. They think that the more they move, the better it is for them. And this is where this rule comes in. If you're gonna be dancing, less is more. Okay, I find that players that try to use like movement to their advantage, they kind of do not account for a couple of things. Number one, when you move left or right, your crosshair moves with you. Okay. And the second thing is when you move, you also have to account for what your mouse is doing. So let's say this green brush right here is where I'm moving my mouse, and this red right here is where I'm moving with my keys. Okay. You're going to notice that these two are going to cancel out. This is an example of how movement and aim kind of tend to work with one another. So what I found is to have the best success in winning those fights where you're not ready, okay, and let's say you can't get back into cover and you've been dancing, sometimes you need to do one or the other. From the best players that I've seen, okay, I've found that sometimes they just keep their crosshair and they move it for very little, okay, so again, they might be doing something like maybe with their mouse, they might do tiny little movements. They're not actually trying to move all that much and try to be like, you know, trying to catch them. Instead, they're just moving very little and they're letting their movement actually do most of their work. And sometimes vice versa. Sometimes I've noticed that they do tiny little jitter steps. They're moving, then maybe they're tapping D, they're not actually holding it. Maybe they're just doing AD, right? They're not really moving all that much, right? But they're moving their mouse a lot. And that is the second thing, okay? So make sure that you're paying attention to how much you're moving either or, because it does impact how you take that fight. Okay. And last but not least, raw mechanics. Okay. Sometimes you do want to take that fight like I just showed just here, where, oh, it's not prepared for me, but I can still flick there. Okay. If you like to use aim labs, there's one called Valorant Small Flicks. And I think that if you use Kovacs, I think it's called the same thing. I suggest that you look it up. It's pretty easy if someone just want to write it in chat or something like that. Valorant Small Flicks for both aim labs and Kovacs. Aim labs is free. So if you guys want to try that one, it is very easy to kind of practice. You're going to be practicing those motions of basically trying to hit an opponent around this range. Okay. So if you have a really hard time hitting those shots, make sure you're practicing this. Okay. So last few things to kind of cover. So let's talk about this part right here. Oh my God, it's such a disaster. I'll make a new little square right here. Let me give you some tips in case you are trying to get better at movement and you need to kind of like strengthen your journey. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what you can do. Okay, the first thing is make sure you're jiggling back and forth. If you remember, there's a little bit of a movement curve. Okay, you might start slow, but then it peaks up pretty quickly. Okay, it peaks about, you know, maybe half a second, maybe less than half a second. Okay, but you are going to feel it. When you're moving back and forth, make sure you're taking longer jiggles rather than shorter ones. I start slow back and forth. If you're trying to get better at movement, then you need to kind of like strengthen your journey. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what you can do. Okay, the first thing is make sure you're jiggling back and forth. If you remember, there's a little bit of a movement curve. Okay, you might start slow, but then it peaks up pretty quickly. Okay, it peaks about, you know, maybe half a second, maybe less than half a second. Okay, but you are going to feel it. When you're moving back and forth, make sure you're taking longer jiggles rather than shorter ones. And the reason for that is when you're jiggling back and forth and you're not taking your time and you're moving very slowly, you're going to appear like you're not moving at all on the enemy screen. Pay attention to how much you're jiggling. Make sure you're paying attention to how much you're taking your once. And the reason for back and forth, make sure you're taking longer jiggles rather than shorter ones. And the reason for that is when you're jiggling back and forth and you're not taking your time and you're moving very slowly, you're going to appear like you're not moving at all on the enemy screen. Pay attention to how much you're jiggling. Make sure you're paying attention to how much you're taking your time in taking those swings. Because even if you have this little T right here, maybe you have this eye all set up and whatnot, you're still going to be moving in that yellow that I showed earlier. You're still going to be moving, ooh, wrong one. You're still going to be moving right here where this box is. You're not going to be appearing any faster, okay? Make sure you're using that speed to your advantage, okay? And the second thing that I wanted to cover is simply pay attention to how you are overswinging, okay? I'd rather you guys learn to practice maybe in the range, maybe in a deathmatch. Try to practice swinging tiny little bits, you know, tiny little pieces rather than taking way too much. A good way for you to practice is, again, team deathmatch. You're always going to have a fight in front of you. So you're always welcome to try to find ways to pre-aim and pre-fire the opponent. Okay. Are there any questions that you guys may have or something that you guys want me to demonstrate again?
I don't have a question, but I have a quick tip. When you go into deathmatch, you should bind your W to your melee. So you can only use this. Bind your W to the melee button.
Why is that?
It just gives me at least a habit of just using only A and D to peek. And not my W because I'll just have my knife out.
I see. Well, here's the thing though. I do see where the tip is going. It's very similar to unbinding your key. I would say refrain from doing so because what we're going to be talking about in the next section is going to be talking about pathing. Okay. And when you're pathing, you got to understand that sometimes there's safe sprinting and sometimes there's unsafe sprinting. Okay. And a good way to understand that is when you're looking at your character. Okay. When you're looking at your character, there's a ring in the minimap and you can see right outside the rings when people can hear you or not. Okay. And sometimes you might be in the ring where they can still hear you. So you got to make sure that your rifle is out during those times. So while it is good to practice, I would say maybe practice it when you're doing deathmatch. Maybe that's where you meant it. But if you're doing it in the game, I would encourage you to not do that because there will be times where you need to actually move forward and sprint quickly, but you need your gun out. Okay. So it is important to kind of mention those things. And yeah, that's kind of something that I wish I had time for, but that's pretty much one of the big things that I wanted to cover. Okay. So I've shown you some warm-ups that you guys can try in the range. I've shown you some examples of slicing the pie. I've shown you why it is good to keep your speed optimally. And I've shown you where it is best to keep your speed optimal at, right? Make sure you're finding that angle that someone's going to fight, right? So someone is going to be taking the fight with me right here. Then you can pretty much just predict that line if they're in front of you. Okay. Do I have any questions or anything of the sort? We're going to be jumping right into practice. So if you want to stick around and just jump into the range, share your screen, I'm going to give you a chance to kind of practice in the range and I can see how your movement is doing. Okay. After that, if you're feeling like your sensitivity is not doing too well, maybe I can help you with that. Sometimes I feel like I shouldn't be changing it. Okay. It's just a matter of movement. Okay. Maybe you'll jump into a deathmatch or a team deathmatch. You guys can do it in buddies or in pairs if you wish, but that's another thing. It's just in case you want to. Do I have any last few questions before I close the class?
I had a question.
Yes.
So what if you're trying to slice the pie in an area where you can get shot at from each side? Kind of like a corridor, like on Ascent on A site.
Ascent on A site? Are we talking about...
Like coming from...
Is it the one where the orb is right here? Am I...
No, it's like near CT spawn.
It's CT spawn A site.
Like, what if you can get shot from each side? How should you peek that?
Oh, you're talking about CT. Okay. Okay. So...
Like how you would enter...
So
from
in
CT.
those angles right there, okay, in those angles, what you want to make sure that you're doing and you're paying attention to. I think I got it right. There we go. So the way that you want to make sure you're doing this. I believe it's like this, right? There's a little entrance here, and then this is A side, and then this is like B side over there. When you're going into an angle, right, then you want to make sure that you're taking the fight as safe as possible. You have to keep the context of what is already cleared. Okay. Of course, there's instances where the enemy could be both left and right. And that's where we have to just take a chance. Okay. It is a coin flip. Sometimes they might be on the right. Sometimes they might be on the left when you have to take those fights. Some of them are just not possible to take. Okay. Sometimes you have to just clear and take your time when you're clearing one area. Of course, however, that is the easiest answer to give because sometimes you just only have time for one. But if you're able to take your time, if you're able to slowly clear those angles and you're slowly able to kind of like clear one and then the other, my encouragement, it would be to find discrepancies in the walls. So a good example of this is Bind. If you've ever gone towards hookah, you've noticed that when you go into hookah, okay, there's a slight discrepancy where if you were planning ahead of time,